Good morning, friends, and welcome as we gather again on this Tuesday after Labor Day. I hope you had a really good holiday. I was celebrating my birthday myself, which was kind of fun. It kind of felt like lots of people were celebrating my birthday. Um, so I hope you had a good time resting and relaxing a little bit this weekend. I'm so glad you've come to be with me today for another episode of Wandering Toward Wonder, a time I get to spend with you each week on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard, thinking about how to cultivate wonder and joy and hope in our daily lives. My name is Will Ed Green, and I currently serve as an associate pastor and the director of discipleship for Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. I'm tuning in today from my little slice of the city in Brightwood Park, which is just north of Petworth. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. I never cease to be amazed from where folk join in from. And so, whether you're one of my Foundry friends here in the city or the DMV, or you're elsewhere in the country, I would love to know where you're watching from. So, take a moment and let us know in the comments now where you're tuning in from as you do so today. I also want to make sure that you know that, as always, there are a myriad of ways to get connected to everything that's going on at Foundry in this season. And of course, as we continue to be socially distant and spiritually together, all of those options are available online. So no matter where you're joining in from or where you're watching from, if you're looking for ways to grow, engage, learn, and connect in faith, I encourage you to find ways to do that through some of the programming we're offering. All of that is open and available to you. We list all of that in a weekly e-newsletter that comes out on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. called Connections. That gets posted on our Facebook page, so you can always check there. But if you'd like to receive that in your email inboxes, you can always sign up for it at https://bit.ly/foundry connections. Or check our Facebook page. Again, there are multiple places to get plugged into that, and I hope that you'll receive that as a gift for connection in this season. So if you tuned in last week, you'll know that we spent some time last week talking about grace, and that was really the beginning of a four-part series that we wanted to have on the Wesleyan Way of Grace. Wesleyan being in reference to the theology of John Wesley, who helped found the movement that became the Methodist Church. We did some important context setting last week, and so if you're joining me for the very first time today and you're interested at the close of our time now, I'd encourage you to go back and watch last week's video so that you can get some of that other information. But today I want to dive right into what I sometimes call the trimodal experience of God's grace. That's just a fancy cocktail party way of talking about the different ways that we experience God's grace over the course of our lives. So there are three unique ways that we Methodists talk about the experience of God's grace. The first word that we use for that experience is prevenient grace. That's the grace that goes before, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. The second way that we experience that we sometimes call justifying grace. We'll talk about that next week, so I hope you'll tune in. And then the final way that we talk about this is in the experience of sanctifying grace, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks. So again, I hope you'll join us for the rest of this series. And I just want to note before we go any further that these aren't separate these aren't separate kinds of grace. They're just three ways that you and I, as we grow in our understanding of God's love, experience the grace of God as an active part of our lives. So like I said, today we're going to talk for just a few minutes about the first way, prevenient grace. Now, the word prevenient may seem a little odd to those of us that are not part of the church world. And in fact, it may just seem odd, period. It's a pretty archaic word. It comes from the Latin prae, meaning before, and venire, meaning coming. So literally coming before. And so last week, if we said grace is a part of loving conversation in which God is speaking God's love to us and inviting us to respond. Prevenient grace are those first words of the conversation that God is whispering to us, perhaps even before we can receive them or before we know the conversation has begun. Prevenient grace really, it encapsulates this idea of God's loving orientation toward us, right? From the very moment that we're born, in which God is setting the stage for us to know God's love, to experience it in its fullness, and two, over time, become aware of that love in a way that allows us to recognize our own sin, the broken things in us that prevent our being in loving relationship with God and with others, and begin the process of healing that brokenness so that we can be most fully who God has called and created us to be. If you've ever watched a bird build a nest around your home or in a park, I like to think about this sometimes as a bird building a nest, right? Long before the eggs are laid, long before the chicks hatch, the bird begins to build a nest, to create a space, a safe place in which their young might grow into adulthood. And so if we think about faith as a journey in which we are moving towards spiritual adulthood, right? Prevenient grace is kind of God building the nest that holds us, right? Long before we're ever even aware that we're in the nest. So there are some really specific and important things that this says theologically, right? Prevenient grace says something very specific about God, right? Primarily that God is active and present in our lives in an intimate way. There are some ways of thinking out there that suggest that God is kind of a clockmaker God, or that God put creation into motion and is kind of outside looking in, right? Or maybe that God is kind of aware of all things and just kind of watching it all unfold, right? Like God has laid out the roadmap and we're just kind of riding on the map that God has put in place. But prevenient grace, in this really beautiful and powerful way, suggests that God is aware of us, and not only that God is aware of us, but that God is pursuing us actively, right? That God is in love with and always loving us, and trying to create spaces and places in our lives where we're aware of, we're growing in awareness of that love. Charles Wesley, who was John Wesley's brother, wrote a hymn that we don't often sing anymore called "Sinners Turn, Why Will You Die?" The title may help you understand why some folk are a little reticent to sing it. But he really picks up on this theme, Charles does, in this lyric. Sinners turn, why will you die? God the Spirit asks you why. He who all your lives hath strove, wooed you to embrace his love, right? Who all your lives hath strove, wooed you to embrace his love. God is pursuing us, wooing us into relationship, right? The second thing that prevenient grace kind of lifts up for our awareness that I think is really beautiful is that God's love is not dependent on our action, right? And so this loving relationship that we enter into with God does not first require our action or our participation, but rather that God is initiating it, right? So grace is not this well out there that we have to tap into, but rather something that is all around us, right? Think about fish being in the ocean, right? They may not be aware that they're wet, but they're always wet. And in that same way, we're kind of fish swimming in a sea of God's grace. And our awareness of that grace over time, right, doesn't change the fact that the grace has always been there. For Wesley, this was really important, right? Because the idea of salvation by grace alone, meaning that we are saved from sin and brokenness by grace and not by our action, is really, really important for our Methodist kind of way of being, right? We don't earn God's grace. It's always a part of our lives, which also means, and this is really important, I think, right, and liberating, particularly in pandemic times, that even when we don't get it right, even when our churches get it wrong, even when we mess up, God's grace is this safety net of love that's there to catch us and catch other people, and there's nothing that we can do to change it, right? And so even when we get a relationship that we're in wrong, we do the wrong thing, even when we speak the wrong thing, God's grace is there to help make sure that our action does not prevent somebody else necessarily from experiencing God's love, right? And it's the same way then that we can say that over time people change, and we give space for people to do that because we understand that God's grace is wooing us at different times and in different ways. The next thing that I think is really important to lift up here, and this is one of those things that sets Methodism and several other traditions apart, is that prevenient grace is really necessary for us to believe in free will, which is our belief that because of God's love for us, our futures are not set in stone, but that rather God gives us agency in our lives to make decisions about who we are and how we love God or not, right? We get to exercise this agency in our lives, including the ability to choose right and wrong. So again, God is not a clockmaker God that's set out our futures in some unchangeable stone, right? Like there's not a tablet that has our lives written out on it, but rather God is in the midst of our decision making and our being and our showing up. And again, whether we get it wrong or we get it right, God is still wooing us, moving us slowly toward a growing awareness of God's love, right? And I think that's really critical. That's really, really critical. Because it's part of the way then that we are able to extend, again, God's grace to other people, right? We aren't static creatures with the world happening around us, right? And we're not immutable creatures with the world changing around us. We're always growing and shifting and changing. And prevenient grace is the way we're able to say, you know what, that person really drives me crazy. But they may not always be that way. They don't have to be that way. And the way that I perceive them now is not the way they'll be in the future, precisely because of God's grace active in their lives. This is also really important, particularly because, as we talked about last week, Wesley believes in what we call original sin, right? The way in which sin, which is a natural part of a world in which free will exists, our ability to choose grace, to choose love, or not. It's part of what allows us to say that even as that original sin in the world builds up on us and impacts our ability to make good and right decisions or not, and even though sin is an inevitable part of our lives in the world, and indeed may be the norm, we are still able to choose that loving relationship with God, right? Prevenient grace is the way in which we can say, even though sin may color the way we show up in everything we do, and in every relationship we have because of God's grace, which is actively pursuing us, which is preparing the nest, which is speaking God's love into our lives, we're able to grow in our awareness of God's love to the point that we can see that sin for what it is, and then begin the process of cleaning the window, of moving deeper into the house, which was Wesley's analogy. Wesley once said in a sermon, the first wish to please God, the first dawn of light concerning God's will, the first slight transient conviction of having sinned against God, that is what prevenient grace enables, right? Our ability to arrive at an awareness that we need God's grace in order to be able to become the people we're called and created to be, right? Prevenient grace helps not only set the stage, but liberate us so that we can begin the process of growth and transformation. This is all part of the reason that for Methodists, we baptize babies, right? Because we recognize that baptism as a symbol of and witness to the power of God's grace, which is saving us, not that saves us in a static moment, but is always saving us. We're recognizing God's grace in that baby's life because God's grace is always there, right? And it's a communal way that we commit ourselves to helping children grow in their awareness of it too. It's part of the reason Methodists don't believe that baptism is necessary for salvation, right? The water is not some kind of baby magic that's somehow suddenly going to transform the child, but rather it's a recognition, a physical way of embodying that which God is already doing in that child's life. And in some ways, becoming ourselves vehicles of that prevenient grace through which that child will grow in their own awareness of God's love. And this brings me, I think, to one of the things that I think is the most beautiful and wonder-inducing and awe-inspiring about the gift of prevenient grace. That if we believe that God is actively pursuing us, and if we believe that God is always setting the stage, regardless of our awareness or not, then every moment and every encounter and every person in our lives becomes a vehicle by which God's grace can be spoken into it. So think about that for a moment. Can you remember, or do you have somebody in your life who has helped you know you're loved in a way that you might not have otherwise known? Is there a place in your life where you feel particularly connected to something deeper than yourself? Are there things that you do, rituals you participate in, that help you access the gift of your own belovedness, which God speaks into your life over and over and over again? Those are all ways that we encounter the prevenient grace, the preceding grace of God. So look back across the course of your life and think about where perhaps you've experienced that, right? Sunday school teachers. I think about the pastor that I remember first having as a child, Brother Charlie Settle, we called him. And Brother Charlie was infinitely patient with young Will, who always had these really bizarre questions about what I was learning in Sunday school and church. And often he would open up his office on a Sunday morning, I'm sure, as he was preparing to preach, and let me kind of wander in my 3 or 4-year-old self and just quiz him. And with love and with patience, created space for me to grow. He was a way in which God was building the nest that helped me grow in my awareness of God's love to the point that I was able to claim that love for myself. So, as you're wandering toward wonder this week, I want to invite you to practice some awareness of where you're becoming aware of, able to perceive the preceding grace of God. Maybe it's a relationship you share with somebody. Maybe it's the time you get to spend out on a kayak in the water. Maybe it's the simple practice of sharing coffee with your beloved in the morning. But practice an awareness of that. And then remember to give thanks for the way that God, even when we are unaware, is still actively pursuing us. And that's not reliant on anything that we might do, or any skill we might have, or even any intention or lack thereof we might bring, but rather that simply because we are, and God is, there is love given to us by God unconditionally and without question. I hope you receive that as a gift, especially as we lean into this fall, continuing in this moment of pandemic. I hope you're able to practice some of that awareness. And I hope that as you continue wandering toward wonder, you will find ways to put yourself fully in the flow of God's grace, so that whether you're aware that you're swimming in it, or you've not yet quite become aware of just how much you're swimming in it, you may never doubt that God's grace is available to you. I'm glad that you joined me today, friends. If this has been helpful, please let me know in the comments if you've got additional questions. If you want to continue the conversation, I would love to do that. So sound off in the comments and I'll do my best to respond over the course of the day. I want to encourage you to continue finding ways to connect. Again, there's some exciting stuff happening this fall at Foundry. So make sure that you're staying connected with connections. And be sure to join us tomorrow at noon for Ponderings from the Purple Parlor with Pastor Ginger. And of course, every day throughout the kind of working week, where our pastors are here to provide devotions throughout the day. So friends, thank you for joining me. And remember, as you keep wandering toward wonder, that God loves you and that I love you, and to always be gentle with yourself, trusting that God's grace abounds for you. Until next time, friends, take care of yourselves. We'll see you soon.